Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes, but I'm just going to wait a few more moments for more participants to come into the platform. So thanks for joining, and we'll get started shortly. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Ann Grenna-Manley. I'm the founder and president of 15E Communications based in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to be moderating the session. Today, we'll be discussing some of the unique challenges and considerations related to identifying and managing PFAS risks in commercial real estate transactions. This is obviously an extremely important topic and quickly evolving, so we are so thrilled that we have so many of you with us here today. ERIS, as you may know, is an environmental risk data and information services company that provides high-quality reports for environmental site assessors conducting phase 1 and phase 2 site assessments of real property, and uses the most advanced platforms and tools to help environmental professionals review and analyze critical environmental data records and historical products to make their clients' work lives easier. We are so fortunate to have such a stellar group of panelists joining us today. I'd like to welcome each of them and give a brief introduction, but I'll also encourage you to visit erisinfo.com, and I think we're going to be posting the exact link to the page in the chat function here so that you can read a fuller profile for each. Before we get started, I also want to mention that we will be doing a Q&A after the formal presentations. So if you could please send your questions into the Q&A section of the platform rather than the chat, we'll be able to see them there. So now I'm going to go on to introducing the speakers. We will first hear from Dr. Janet Anderson. Janet is a principal toxicologist with GSI Environmental Inc. She's a recognized leader in unregulated and emerging contaminants, including PFAS and 1,4-dioxane, and has more than 15 years of experience providing toxicology and risk management strategies to federal agencies, private industry, and municipal clients. Then we will hear from Andy Basor. Andy is the senior project manager with TTI Environmental Inc., where he provides consulting services for due diligence projects, including phase 1 and 2 environmental assessments, and management of multi-level environmental investigation and remediation projects at federal facilities, commercial and industrial sites. We will then turn to Melanie Veltman. Melanie is the Director of Research and Data at ERIS and leads the company's data team. Her innovative approaches have allowed ERIS's team of analysts to greatly expand their work researching, collecting, analyzing, and loading tens of millions of environmental risk records for the US, Canada, and Mexico. So without further delay, I'm going to turn things over to Janet.
Thank you, Mary Ann. So let me get this started for us. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation today. Today, I'll be kicking us off and talking about PFAS toxicology and providing a regulatory overview, talking about how we got to where we are and where we anticipate going next. The key take-home points for my portion of the conversation today. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of a chemistry lesson, just because the nomenclature is complicated. It is a bit of an alphabet soup. And I'd like to impress upon you that not PFAS are all the same. So they're an extremely diverse class of chemicals. We'll talk a little bit about why that matters. In toxicology, we often do have a little bit of variability and uncertainty around our interpretation of the data, but for PFAS, it's extremely rare that we have such high variability and uncertainty. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And actually, for even PFOA and PFOS, the most well-studied perfluorinated compounds, there's not a clear consensus on actually the adverse human health effects or clear disease associated with exposures. We'll talk about what is driving the part per trillion levels. And then again, as I mentioned, we'll read our crystal balls a little bit and talk about what we think is coming next with regard to science, regulation as well. So to kick things off, the alphabet soup of PFAS. I'm sure you guys have heard all the different acronyms, PF something. The letters matter though. Each individual chemical has some unique properties, and it's important that we understand it's a very diverse class of chemicals. In fact, recently, an Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development released a document just last year that nicely stated that when we use the term PFAS, we're actually often speaking in very broad and non-specific terms that can lead to ambiguity and some factual inaccuracies. So we have to be pretty careful when we're using the term PFAS and be very specific about what we mean and what we don't mean and which chemicals. The reality is there's actually not a consensus definition for PFAS that is globally recognized. Different agencies have different definitions. There are different definitions for different problem formulations or different regulatory scopes. PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, is an extremely diverse group of chemicals. Trying to group them all together or think that they're all the same really is scientifically unjustified. We've got polymers, which are very, very large, generally not even biologically available. So they're too large to cross the cell membrane. And then we also have the non-polymers. This is the more classic PFOA, PFOS types of chemicals. So in general, although it's a very large class of chemicals, some of these PFAS are environmentally persistent. In fact, most PFAS either are environmentally persistent or can degrade into something that is environmentally persistent. Some of them are very mobile in the environment, not all of them are. And that mobility results in widespread and potentially ubiquitous exposure, very large potential groundwater plumes, for example. Some PFAS, just a small amount of them, can bioaccumulate in humans and food chain, which means that our health advisories and concerns about this bioaccumulation means that we have very low part per trillion, potentially even part per quadrillion levels. Regardless of what PFAS we're talking about, is all of them are going to be a challenge, from analytical capabilities to understanding potential health risks, and it's going to result in some expensive investigations, remediations, or litigations. So again, if we think about just the non-polymers, because these are the ones that are really of concern in the environment and for potential human health, we've got perfluorinated compounds, and the per means all. So every single carbon is fully fluorinated. That's the classic PFOA, PFOS, the C8 chemicals that we often hear about. This group of chemicals actually represents, though, less than 0.5% or less than 0.5% of the entire group of PFAS. And so when we talk about potential concerning characteristics of PFOA and PFOS, we have to ask ourselves, well, would those characteristics be applicable to the rest of the non-polymers, especially the polyfluorinated substances? Poly just means many. So in those categories of the family group, some of the carbons are not fully fluorinated. They may have a hydrogen, there may be oxygens stuck in the middle. So there's a wide variety of different chemical characteristics and chemical groups on the polyfluorinated substance side. But really, again, it's PFOA, PFOS, and those compounds that are fully fluorinated that have resulted in widespread concern for human and environmental health. So these are anthropogenic chemicals. They've really been around since the 1940s. We still have evolving science trying to better understand everything from potential health effects to fate and transport and potential exposures and sources, particularly PFOA and PFOS, and similarly fully fluorinated chains of carbons often are regarded as persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So that PBT characteristic means a regulatory extra concern. But importantly, they may not be characteristic or representative of the full class of PFAS. So distinguishing those differences is really an active area of research, and it's really important that we gather more information to understand what is relevant for PFOA and PFOS, and is that relevantly extrapolated to other PFAS. So I want to talk just a little bit about their toxicity, because that, after all, is why the concern. So importantly, as a toxicologist, I have to apologize. Toxicology is not a precise science. You do not want a toxicologist to build you a bridge. We talk about things in orders of magnitude certainty. That's about as precise as we typically are. So for most chemicals, if you have two different authoritative agencies or groups of toxicologists, and we evaluate the science around the potential health risks for human health, for example, if we're in within order of magnitude, we call it good. We're generally consistent. Deriving these threshold values, for example, a drinking water level, requires an understanding of the full weight of evidence of the science, picking that critical study, or what are the health effects that are of concern, understanding the different doses that response may happen, figuring out how to extrapolate that to different human scenarios, and under what different exposure assumptions. All of those are critical decision points for deriving those threshold levels. And for PFAS, all of them have some pretty wide different interpretations of the science and difference in regulatory applications and decision-making. That's resulted in about a 2 order of magnitude difference, even for just PFOA and PFOS. So shown here are just examples of some of the groundwater and drinking water values we have available. Different states may have a groundwater value or a drinking water value. Some of these are promulgated, some of these are guidance. This is meant just to show the range of the value. And as you can see, the current 70 part per trillion US Environmental Protection Agency Health Advisory is at the lower end there, kind of in the middle, but certainly no longer the lowest. The full up-to-date tracking of the values can be found on the ITRC website. That's a really nice resource to go to because they constantly every month update the listing of the regulatory values internationally. So why do we have this 2 order of magnitude difference? Well, it can be summarized basically in 3 different buckets. One, we still have different interpretations of the science, even for PFOA and PFOS, much less so for some of the other PFAS that are less well studied. 2, as I mentioned, some of the values I showed are for drinking water, some are for groundwater. Different regulatory programs have actually different policy and science policy determinations just inherent in the program themselves. Sometimes it's actually not really correct to compare a groundwater value with a drinking water value. It's kind of an apples and oranges. And so that can result in some quantitative differences in the number for good policy reasons. And 3, we still have some locations globally, but even here in the US, where there just haven't been identified large drinking water impacts and not a lot of community awareness and not a lot of regulatory involvement to push and request or have local, especially at the state level, regulatory values. We still don't have federal MCLs. And so that results in some locations still in this country where there's really still no action being taken with regard to PFOA and PFOS, specifically looking for remediation or environmental responses. So as I said, the science is still interpreting a challenge to interpret. In the 2016 document, EPA says that there's consistent evidence generally for associations with either PFOA or PFOS and a range of about 5 different health effects. The weight of the evidence and where the agency still is leaning is challenges or concerns for increased cholesterol, changes in antibody response, and decreased birth weight to neonates exposed in utero. However, contrast that with determinations, for example, made by Australia. So the Australian Department of Health has said, we agree that there's these associations with some of these health outcomes, but there's actually limited or no evidence of an actual causal link, meaning exposure to PFOA and PFOS caused that effect, and that effect is going to lead to a human disease. So that's still the real challenge, is trying to understand what is the association with exposure that's going to actually adversely impact human health outcomes. We do have a lot of toxicity assessments underway at the EPA. So they very recently have finalized assessments for 2 compounds, PFBS, that's the 4-chain sulfonate, Gen X. Probably many of you are aware that PFOA and PFOS are up for MCL, so the maximum contaminant levels, and we have draft documents supporting the derivation of those. And other perfluorinated compounds are also in development at EPA. These draft MCL determinations will considerably lower, if they are released in their current form, where we think that safe threshold for human exposure would be. For both PFOA and PFOS, they're based on concerns about reduced vaccine efficiency or immune suppression. And they're based on human data collected from children in the Faroe Islands. They, as I mentioned, are much more conservative, much more lower than the 2016 assessment. Also, EPA has determined that PFOA may actually be considered likely to be a carcinogen to humans. If that classification holds, then the MCL goal will likely be 0. What else is happening at the EPA? Well, actually quite a lot. EPA got a lot of criticism for a long time for not having a lot come out in the public space. They were doing a lot internally, but they've really solidified their commitments to action in what they call their strategic roadmap. In the interest of time, I'm not really going to go through this whole big list, but really there is not an environmental media or an investigation or an area of research that EPA is not working towards. They're working towards understanding PFAS, obviously in our drinking water, in our wastewater, in our air, understanding how to better develop enforcement and compliance actions, understanding how to regulate PFAS under CRE, under hazardous substance listing, and the list goes on. The document's actually pretty easy to read, so if you want more information, please go to EPA's website. While we're waiting for a lot of EPA's commitments to take into effect, the states actually still are leading the charge. Shown here is, again, is just a color-coded map of the various states that either have a promulgated standard or a guidance value. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, some states still really rely upon that guidance and the promulgation to come at the federal level. It's not just drinking water or groundwater, though. Many states, and it's not just PFOA and PFOS, many states have expanded their list of perfluorinated compounds to include some of the other fully fluorinated compounds, or including Gen X, PFOA, PFOS, PFBX, the C4s, the C6, the C9. It's not just drinking water, so we do have some surface water quality standards in some states, and more are in development. Many states are concerned about the pathways of land application of perfluorinated compounds, particularly through biosolids, for example, and how that may result in groundwater contamination, which could be a source for drinking water and human exposure. Air, I mentioned EPA is working on that, but several states already have some air standards for some PFAS. And also identifying new PFAS. So how can we even expand our list beyond the classic, somewhere around 40 to 70, depending on your lab, analytical list? What are these novel PFAS? And so several states are collaborating with EPA in kind of a research effort to try to understand what are releases to the environment of these unidentified or novel PFAS. So what do we think is next? Well, we know that at least PFOA and PFOS are likely to be listed as CRE hazardous substances, and that's going to cause some reopening of CRE sites throughout the states, and it's going to cause some increased attention and effort around the remediation. We can continue to see increased NRD and ecological claims, natural resource damages and ecological claims, wastewater permit violations and challenges about what gets put on your NEPDES permit and what doesn't. Product liability and medical monitoring are some of the things we're starting to really see in litigation, as well as just property development, fraudulent transfer and redevelopment claims. In the science, though, is a little bit lagging. We're trying to understand the expanded suite of PFAS, and again, the properties that may or may not be consistent with the ones that we already understand to be associated with PFOA and PFOS. Further evaluations of toxicity. Our exposures are to multiple PFAS, though, so what happens when we're exposed to many different PFAS? What are the impacts of being exposed through inhalation or surface water or biosolids? What is the fate transport of those compounds? What I'm seeing a lot of is this forensic analysis or source allocation. So in conclusion, we've got states moving ahead of the federal government still, but I think we can see a lot, and we can expect to see a lot from EPA. But right now, we still have a pretty inconsistent patchwork of regulations, legislation, and just requests for sampling and actions. But we are expanding to not just PFOA and PFOS and not just drinking water. We can expect some pretty big changes to happen under CRE, under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, and additional toxicity information from EPA. I think the chemical fingerprinting and the source identification is going to become a really big player as we start to do a better job of understanding the wide breadth of potential environmental sources and sites across this country. And that leads to more increased attention to, well, what really is the toxicity and the risk? Just because it's present doesn't mean it may be a risk. So we have to understand what levels of concern, which PFAS are concerned, and what combination. And lastly, some really important, I think, changes in industry from opportunities and tools such as ERIS, where we've got risk management actions and risk management decisions happening internally, where we're seeing a lot of industries take some internal data gathering, increase in attention on phase ones and due diligence, and just better job of proactively tracking regulations. So with that, I think I'm at the end of my presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Andy Basor, my new friend and colleague with TTI Environmental, to take the next phase. If I can stop sharing for you, and it's all you, Andy.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going to do the PFOS, taking the consultant or the environmental professionals look at the issues that we have with potential PFOS as far as it goes for environmental due diligence and for phase ones and for property transactions. So I'd like to begin anytime that I'm talking about an environmental due diligence or a phase one topic with the definition of what is a REC. So I don't want to read all the words on the slide, but let's just hit some high points. The presence of a hazardous substance or petroleum product on the subject site or likely presence. And then due to a release or material threat of a future release. And then, of course, we have to hit what's a hazardous substance. And the key word here is anything that's listed under Circular 42 as basically, that's our hazardous substances. And of course, then there's additional information with hazardous waste, RECRA substances, so on and so forth. So one of the issues that we have as environmental professionals is that the PFOS compounds are not listed as hazardous substances. So they don't show up as a CERCLA substance or as a RECRA substance, but ASTM in the newest rendition of the phase one E1527-21 has come up with, there is at least an acknowledgement that these contaminants are possibly out there and they may be impacting the property, they may impact future use of properties, and they may impact liability for properties. So the ASTM has come up with that basically they may be considered a hazardous substances under applicable state laws. We do phase ones for CERCLA liability. But if we're trying to meet our state laws, we also need to think about what each of our states that we're working in, what their requirements are as far as PFOS. So we're not just thinking that CERCLA as a big picture, we also have to think that we're doing our due diligence to at least let our clients know what the state that they're working in, what their requirements are as far as conducting investigation for PFOS. So my map is a little bit older with states that have PFOS regulations or some type of a drinking water or groundwater standard, and we saw from previous slides that Janet had, she had a few more states on her map. I think that this is from June of 2021. So things move fast in this world of PFOS regulation, and it really does take a lot of keeping track with whatever state you're working in as an environmental professional, knowing those regulations to be able to give your client the best product that you possibly can. ASTM in the 1527-21 basically says that we should consider PFOS as a business environmental risk. And I think that it actually fits really nicely in as a business environmental risk because it is an environmentally driven impact to the site. Doesn't meet the the requirements or for being a hazardous substance because it's not federally regulated currently. And the presence of PFOS contamination on or at the property could present a significant amount of impact for risk and for exposure on the property. So what products contain our PFOS? These things are everywhere and in a lot of different products that we come into contact with on a daily basis. And some of these cookware, absolutely, I cook with cookware all the time where I'm probably touching Teflon once a day and making food on it. And so they are common and we do use them every day. So where I see, as an environmental professional, where I see the potential for exposure for risk of PFOS in commercial real estate, machine shops, paper manufacturing, airports and firefighting training facilities, plating operations, electronic manufacturing, wastewater treatment plants, and landfills. And I'm going to focus in on some plating operations that we have investigated, and also talk a little bit about some fire training facilities as well. So one of the issues that we have as environmental professionals is we don't have a lot of tools available to us from a database standpoint, like we do with record generators or circular listings for potential PFOS. We have to rely on a lot of other sources, our fire insurance maps, our city directories, safety data sheets, if we can get them from the facility. And sometimes we just have to fall back on some good old local knowledge of what's around our site and what's in the region. In this case, we had some RECRA listings for a plating operation. They had the plating baths with cyanide. They had ended up with cyanide and zinc as some of their RECRA hazardous substances. So the SDS, here's another one. So I did a lookup of ChemGuard 3%, which is an AFFF. That's an aqueous film forming foam. And at no place does it actually come out and say PFOS, PFOA. It says proprietary mixture fluorosurfactant. So we have to know that proprietary mixture fluorosurfactant is probably our PFOS contaminant or of concern for our AFFF. Here's an example of a location that is fairly well studied for PFOS. This is the Willow Grove Naval Air Station. They have some very high concentrations of PFOS that have been detected in monitoring wells around the Willow Grove Naval Air Station. And this becomes an issue for the location that I work in typically, which is New Jersey and Southeast Pennsylvania. This location is in Southeast Pennsylvania in a highly populated area outside of Philadelphia. And there is a large PFOS plume, and there is a lot of residential and commercial areas that directly surround the former Naval Air Station. And we have had several sites that border this that actually fall into a regional plume area that we would say that PFOS is likely to be present on a neighboring site based on the work that's been done to investigate the Willow Grove Naval Air Station. The city directory, once again, found a plating operation using a city directory. And this plating operation was active at the site in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And the city directory was one of the only places that we were able to find anything that there was a plating operation, and a record generator was also able to point out that there was a potential for a plating operation that could hold PFOS contaminants. Fire insurance maps are another way that we can see historic plating operations. And as Janet pointed out, the PFOS compounds have been around since the 1940s. So this isn't a look at something that's only been around for 10 or 20 years. There's been very long use of PFOS in industry, and the other reason that this makes it difficult for us is that the PFOS contaminants, as Janet said, are persistent in the environment. So they're not going to readily break down, and they can last for years, even if the plating operation or fire training facility has not operated for 20 or 30 years. We can still see those contaminants in groundwater. So we identify our PFOS in our phase 1. We recommend to our client that maybe they should to go ahead and do an investigation if they want to complete their due diligence and know whether the property is impacted or not. So then we come into the sampling issues, and the sampling issues are we can't use a PFOS containing substance as part of our sampling materials. So balers, the bladders in bladder pumps, the tubing itself, can't use Teflon tubing. Gore-Tex clothing, are we cross-contaminating our own sample? My opinion is that taking good field blanks and trip blanks, equipment blanks can help to be able to tell whether we're contaminating a sample or whether the sample is contaminating. So there are many factors that go into developing a sampling plan for PFOS, and it can get very expensive quickly, especially considering a phase 2, where a lot of times clients are price adverse, and they always want to know what the lowest price that we can give them to do our work is. And when we're looking at $300 and $400 a sample for a single sample, that can get pretty expensive pretty quickly, and especially when we have to use non-PFOS certified sampling equipment. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie Veltman.
Thank you, Andy. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm quite pleased to be a part of this conversation and working with this group. Okay, I'm just going to make sure that my screen comes up. All right, so today I'll just spend a few moments talking about the experience of my team at ERIS trying to obtain lists of PFOS sites, however we can even define those. I'll clarify that when I'm referring to data, I'm referring to lists of sites, not referring to sampling data or documents. Really the data that I'm referring to, like I said, are lists of sites. That's what we try to obtain, and that's what I'll be referring to. Okay. There we go. So Yes, at the moment, for PFOS data coverage at ERIS, we currently have 4 federal data sources in the US, 39 state level data sources in 32 states, and our work and our search is continuous. In Canada, we don't have a specific PFOS database or data source, and our search continues. But while we continue to search, the PFOS contamination is noted in the federal contaminated sites. And in Mexico, we don't yet have any coverage. But again, we are searching all the time. This is what our coverage looks like at the moment. And there are some interesting things at play on this map that I'll come to in a few slides. I'll clarify also that ERIS's PFOS data are appearing in ERIS direct searches and on our regular database reports. So that's where clients will find these records. And we set a search radius of 0.5 miles. I know that PFOS can travel quite a lot further than 0.5 miles. So this was a determination that was made with other colleagues here at ERIS. And yeah, that's where we're searching them out to. I'm going to describe the way that we searched for PFOS data, these lists of PFOS sites, because PFOS is not, it's not a CERCLA regulated or CERCLA identified chemical or hazard. So the coverage really varies. And when we first started searching, we weren't finding a lot, and the information that we were finding in various states differed quite a lot. So state by state, we would begin with an online search. We would search through the agency website, looking for any information really about their PFAS response. And if we weren't able to find anything on the agency website, then we would follow up with a request to the agency. And our request was not vague. We would ask, you know, if it's possible to obtain a list of sites at which there is or has been groundwater or soil sampling or contamination as a result of the use or release or disposal of perfluorinated alkyl substances, poly or perfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFOS containing materials. We would continue then to ask if they have a list of sites where PFOA or PFOS, these containing materials, is currently or ever has been manufactured, used, stored, disposed of, or released. And we would summarize our request by asking if they had any other resources for lists of locations of PFOS or the poly or perfluorinated alkyl substances, their use, storage, release, or contamination. And these questions that we asked the state level agencies were guided by some of the work that was done by the DEC in New York. And I'll touch on that in a moment. So at the federal level, through searching online and contacting the EPA with these questions, what came back or what we have, what the result is are these 4 federal data sources. So we filed a FOIA request to EPA, and we got a list of sites where PFOA or PFOS contaminants have been found in drinking water or soil, but those are limited to existing NPL sites. So they just identified those NPL sites where PFOS or PFOA was a contaminant of concern. Another federal data source that we have comes from a group at Northeastern University, and they have a PFOS contamination site tracker. This data comes from a variety of places: government websites, news articles, publicly available documents, and this database is undergoing updates quite often. Normally at ERIS, we have a strong preference for data that comes specifically from a federal or a state agency, but this group at Northeastern University, we have a lot of confidence in the data that they've collected, and with the dearth of PFOS data, we felt it was a very good addition to our data. We have PFOS TRI. So these are records from the toxics release inventory, where the reported chemical is a per or polyfluorinated alkyl substance. And similarly, we have PFOS water. So these are records that we've taken from another database, the water quality portal, and we've filtered out to capture only those records where the environmental measurement is a per or polyfluorinated alkyl substance. And we do have some work that's ongoing at ERIS right now on another set of data that the EPA has recently released to another group via FOIA. So when we filter out these TRI and water quality records, we're able to filter those out because there is a clearly delineated chemical of concern, and we're basically cross-referencing that to PFOS master list that's published by the EPA. So on their web page for the PFOS master list, the EPA states clearly that there's no precisely clear definition of what constitutes PFOS substance, and the PFOS master serves as a consolidated list of substances, spanning and bounded by a series of lists. I think the last time I looked, there were 6 or 8 lists. And it's dynamic, it changes often. So at ERIS, we are continuously or continually, I'm not sure which one, but we are updating our version, or we're refreshing this EPA PFOS master list that we're working with, because like I said, it is dynamic. So these are the 32 states in which we have some PFOS data coverage, and there's really a lot of variability. So this is what our map of the ERIS data coverage. And I really want to highlight that these are not like permits data or, for example, underground storage tank data. These data, these state databases that we're searching they're highly variable. And in some cases, the PFOS data that we have at the state level are groundwater samples, where they have sampled for or found PFOS or PFOA. And depending on the state, if the state data includes records where the sample falls below a threshold, we're not doing any filtering on the data to determine whether or not it's above, a federal or a state level threshold. We're simply pulling out those groundwater sampling records where the characteristic or the environmental measurement is a PFOS or PFOA. Just some examples: California, Michigan, and Ohio, we have PFOS groundwater data. In some states, the agency has generated a list of sites where the contaminant of concern is one of these per or polyfluorinated alkyl substances, a PFOS. So the state itself, they may have a specific program, or they may have, within their remediation data, they may have a specific project type for PFOS. So that's what the PFOS data are in some states. And finally, in states where our searches were unsuccessful and our request for PFOS data came back with a negative response, we checked to see if the state level spill or remediation data had a clearly delineated field indicating the contaminant of concern. Where that was the case, so there was no data available online, we contacted the agency, they weren't able to provide us with any listing, but their remediation data has a column indicating the chemical of concern. We would cross-reference that against the master list, and we would pull out those records that are PFOS, and those are, yeah, that's what the PFOS database looks like in some states. So we find the value in that, specifically for the spills data, where spills have a smaller radius. So spills would normally be searched out to 0.125, or yeah, 0.125 I think is the default that we have in most cases. And if a spill record is identified as having a PFOS substance as the contaminant of concern, then clients would be seeing that to a radius of 0.5. So just a few, I'll give two examples of this state level data to really reinforce this variability. So in New York, the Department of Environmental Conservation, in order to better understand the environmental risk posed by PFOS, or to better understand, I guess, where those risks are, they undertook an initiative to send out surveys to facilities that they had identified as possible risk for PFOS. So they had a Class B fire suppression foam usage survey that they sent to airports, military facilities, bulk storage facilities, and state fire departments and training centers. And then they had a PFOA PFOS facility identification survey that they sent to industrial or manufacturing facilities that they had identified. And the surveys here asked a series of questions. They asked if PFOA or PFOS containing material is currently used at the facility, if it was formerly used at the facility, if it was currently, or sorry, if it is currently stored at the facility, if it was formerly stored at the facility, currently manufactured, formerly manufactured, currently being disposed of or released, or formerly disposed of or released at the facility. So this is not a list of sites that are contaminated with PFOS. It's not a list of sites where there have been groundwater sampling, where there has been groundwater sampling for PFOS. But what we did is we took these surveys and we turned it into, like we turned it into data. So these are the types of records that would be coming up on database reports in the state of New York. And again, this was a great resource for us in our search, because we guided our search questions based on the questions that they had sent out in their surveys. The second example that I'll show is in Kansas. So the Department of Health and Environment in Kansas, they undertook a research project, and the result of that research project was a lengthy PDF that was called the Inventory of Potential PFOS Sites in Kansas. And these facilities include those that potentially used, stored, or produced PFOS in Kansas. But they weren't identified, or they didn't participate in surveys. The research work included sites based on SIC code and NAICS codes, specific to the types of business activities, industries, or manufacturing entities related to PFOS use. So again, in Kansas, if your ERIS report has a PFOS record on it, that doesn't mean that it's a PFOS contaminated site. In Kansas, it just means that it was identified as possibly or potentially having used, stored, or produced PFOS based on the SIC or the NAICS code, or in fact, they did have other reasons for including facilities in this inventory. So that's why here you can see in Kansas, I mean, it looks like there's just an explosion of PFOS activity when the reality is that they just, I guess they cast a broader net, or the data represents that it's potential sites, not PFOS contaminated sites. So across all of the states where we have PFOS data, the number of records varies quite a lot. There's some states that have identified 1 site, or 3, or 7, or 9. Kansas, by contrast, has over 9,000 sites in their inventory. And the average across those 32 states is 615 sites per state. Yeah, so like I said, our search is ongoing. We have a 75-day schedule for PFOS data source review. So we have a lot of systems here at ERIS that help us do our work. And yeah, the system basically counts down the number of days until we have to search. And PFOS is one of the databases where we have a separate task, and that task tells my team member to go out and launch a search for new PFOS data. Each state's on a different schedule depending on when we first obtain the data, and when we're going out and launching that new research, we're following the same process as our initial search. Searching online, and then following up with questions to the agency. And then, I mean, as more information comes out, we seek to understand state level regulations, and then how they're implemented, and then how that would lead to representation in the data. Yes, so very happy to be part of this conversation. And at ERIS, I mean, we're very happy to answer questions anytime, or to listen to feedback on our data anytime, especially about PFOS. And anyone who has questions or feedback on ERIS PFOS data would be welcome to contact their sales team member. That's it for me, so I'll send it back to Marianne. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melanie. And thanks also to Andy and Janet they were just all so extremely informative. Your presentations were great. I took lots of notes. I'm sure everybody listening in feels the same. So I just want to remind folks joining us to, again, if you have questions, you can send them in the Q&A chat area. That says Q&A rather than chat. And I'm going to lead us through some questions that I have that sort of build on the conversation that we're starting with the presentations. And so while we're getting our questions going, please make sure you send yours along, and we'll get to those right after. So to follow up with some of what was already discussed, Janet, you talked a lot about what's on the horizon for science and regulations and litigation, but what new trends might we expect from industry targets? Focus has been largely on fire foam use and primary manufacturers, but what other industry targets do you think might be next?
Sure, that's a great question, Marianne, thanks. As Andy mentioned, there's actually a wide range of different industry uses for PFAS. And what we've seen, I think rightfully so, is a focus on the largest volume release areas to the environment. So think thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of gallons of AFFF foam used, think manufacturing facilities and accidental releases from those. So what we're starting to see now is a shift in focus to the secondary manufacturers who use much smaller volumes, perhaps don't have clear environmental release pathways. And so this question about, well, how do we determine and identify and prioritize those types of releases when we're talking about such a smaller mass that may potentially have been released, or different types of PFAS. Maybe the industry doesn't use or didn't use any of the PFOA, PFOS, or fully fluorinated, and they're using different types of polymers or something different. And so we're seeing this shift of focus to the secondary users with big question marks of trying to understand which PFAS are concerned, at what volume might have they been used, and is there actually even a pathway to the environment or a concern for human health from those? So thinking of things like the secondary users of different types of fluoropolymers and the applications and fabrications of those. Things like electronics, where just small levels are used in coating. So some of those types of industries, specialty chemical, oils and lubricants types of industries.
Okay, thanks, Janet. Andy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Janet said, and it's the secondaries that I think are where the commercial real estate due diligence is going to start to play a lot of a factor in it. A lot of times we're not going to be doing due diligence on an airport facility where thousands of gallons of AFFF was used. We're going to be doing due diligence on smaller industry, potentially where protocols were not followed as well as at large manufacturing facilities. And the other issue that we're going to run into is contamination from off-site sources migrating onto a property, and how do we deal with that? Who's liable? And exposure in the commercial real estate market. What we're looking at is how is our potential occupant of the site either going to be exposed, or if we are the release point, are we causing exposure to PFOS to the surrounding community?
Thanks, Andy. And then Melanie, I wanted to give you a minute to chime in. So regarding ERIS's approach in gathering new information, is there anything specific you're focusing on, or what you'll do to try to include some of these new targeted PFAS sources?
Sure, Marianne. So like I mentioned in the slides, we're trying our best to keep our pulse on the trends just by searching those agency websites every 75 to 90 days. We're not focused on any subgroup of industries. And then for specifics about building out our data collection, at the moment, like I mentioned, we're working through some new federal data that was released by the EPA, and that data looks more like the Kansas list. So it's like a list of potential sites. I think there's maybe 110,000. Yeah, so that's all I have at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. So Andy, you talked a lot about some of the practical challenges with PFAS. One thing I wanted to cover a little bit more is about the source and location of PFAS. So how do you know if PFAS is from an on-site release or from a regional plume?
Yeah, this is an issue that we're going to run into, and that we are running into on some sites that I've been involved with investigations. I did a site where it was a potential that we had a regional plume and an on-site plume. We tried to put monitoring wells in that captured the upgradient direction from the regional plume as it was migrating onto the property, and then downgradient from potential release areas on the property. And in that case, we did actually see a background concentration that was migrating onto the site of certain PFOS compounds. And then we had an uptick in other PFOS compounds from the release area into the downgradient portion of the site. So this is another topic that Janet talked about, which is the fingerprinting. Which PFOS is your PFOS, and which PFOS is the regional plumes PFOS?
Janet, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
I mean, Andy is exactly right. I think as the science evolves in our understanding of several key things, first of all, our analyte list available from the commercial labs is growing. So we started with 6, and then we had 12 and 20 something and 30 something. And now some of the labs are offering on a regular basis, 40 to 70. As we start getting more data, we'll be able to do more sophisticated statistical analysis and look for those different signatures and understand fate and transport characteristics of individual PFAS, and then understand when we suddenly have maybe a sample that's an outlier that would signify either a unique source because it's a unique PFAS that shouldn't be associated with source A, or maybe it would just be a change in the ratios or a change in a composition that can't be explained by fate and transport alone, suggesting another source. And so the science is going there. We're seeing a lot of really interesting analysis using a lot of advances in analytical methods, advances in other types of analytics, and also statistical analysis to help us with that. But it's going to be, I think, a really big focus, especially as we're talking about such low levels and distinguishing single digit part per trillion and whose is whose. It's going to be a real challenge for everybody.
Thanks. So Melanie, we obviously have a lot of environmental professionals joining us today for the panel. And so I wanted to turn to you and ask, as if I were one of them, if I see a PFAS record in my database report, what should I do? What kind of context do I need to understand what that means?
Sure, that's a great question. Because like I mentioned in the slides, there's so much variability. So it's really important to understand the record. Read the description of the PFOS database in the appendix, the record search appendix. That database description is going to tell you whether it's a list of groundwater sampling locations or whether it's the list of remediation sites where PFOS is a contaminant of concern, for example. Of course, read the record details. I mean, if it's a PFOS groundwater record, you want to look at those values and see how much PFOS was detected. And I'll note again that we are not filtering any records based on thresholds. We're just including all of the records. Our goal is to reflect the agency data. We don't want to be interpreting and deciding which ones are important. Then, if by contrast, it's a site identified by a state agency as having PFOS contamination, then of course, going to the agency, doing a file review would help give more information about the site. If it's a potential PFOS site identified via the NAICS or SIC code, I think that's where there's a lot of subjectivity. Because unlike tank records, where a tank is a tank is a tank, these potential PFOS records are not as cut and dry or not as clear as that. In any case, I'll also highlight that on the ERIS database reports, the PFOS are showing up as non-standard, which aligns with the ASTM standard for phase 1.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melanie. We do have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to just ask one more before I turn the attention to those. And this gets back a little bit more to the regulatory side. Janet, you mentioned a lot of activity going on at EPA, and one thing that I think this audience is particularly focused on is what happens when PFAS, or if PFAS becomes a CERCLA regulated hazardous substance. So can you just kind of walk us through quickly what some of the pros or cons of that might be, or any kind of unintended impacts or consequences that folks might not be thinking about?
Sure. Well, I think with the CERCLA hazardous substance listing, pros and con definition may depend on your viewpoint and your stakeholder group. But I think at the end of the day, everyone can agree that having some more regulatory framework and understand what we have, these regulatory processes and these statutory requirements laid out for a reason. And so putting them in a clear process is advantageous for everybody. I do think we will see PFOA, PFOS listed as CERCLA hazardous waste. Under the RCRA listing, I don't know, or CERCLA hazardous substance, I should say, under the RCRA listing, I don't know what kind of waste code they're going to get. And that will be really interesting to see, and we'll have some ramifications. I do think that a lot of the information and process like that Andy had talked through will be triggered by these by the listing, which includes site opening. It includes a lot of requirements. It includes a lot of much more clear framework for moving through the regulatory process. It also would allow for cost recovery for some specific industries because it requires perhaps in their insurance policy to be a hazardous substance. And so there's a lot of nuance and a lot of ripple effects in a lot of different areas, both from remediation, but legal perspectives, from an insurance perspective and cost recovery, legal liability claims. So there's a wide cast of domino effects, which is why I think we've really seen EPA try to take this very thoughtfully, and it's required a lot of time and effort and consultation on their part to really understand the ripple effects of listing. But I think, importantly, we do see a lot of remediation already, even without the circular hazardous substance listing. So I want people to understand that it's not required because of all the other reasons, and some of which Andy had touched upon. We don't need to be a circular hazardous substance in order to have remediation. There are other tools, but it will just put you on a more clear path and have much more requirements clearly lined out.
Thanks, Janet. And Andy, I definitely want to give you a chance to chime in here about how this would potentially impact some of the work that you're doing for your clients.
Yeah, so being an LSRP in New Jersey, we do have currently, we have to address PFOS when we're doing an investigation for an entire site. I don't see that is going to change regardless for New Jersey. We're going to always have to do something for New Jersey. For other states and for other clients and other cleanups, it could have impact on a site and for what liability protection that you've received for closure of the site. If you've received liability protection for fluorinated solvents on your site, and that's it, you're not going to have liability protection for PFOS, and you may have to go back and reinvestigate. So I hate to say you're taking the lid off the can of worms, but there's potential that is possible. It also, in my opinion, it leads into what level, how you're consulting with your clients. If you're letting them know upfront that there may be future liability down the road for an issue such as PFOS, even though it's not regulated today, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be regulated tomorrow.
Good point. All right, thanks everybody. We do have a lot of questions here. I'm going to try to get to as many as I can before we run out of time. So I'm going to just jump right into it. One question we have, are PFAS so ubiquitous that perhaps we are finding background concentrations when we sample soil and groundwater outside facilities? So Andy, you want to take that? I see you nodding.
Absolutely. I think that anytime that you're sampling for PFOS, that you have the potential to come up with a PFOS compound or contaminant in any sample that you collect. It is then your job, and this is the hard part, is to figure out whether it's related to your site, related to cross-contamination from your sampling equipment, or related to a release that's a regional plume. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to document how you're collecting your samples, and potential for finding out that you definitely have PFOS or you don't have PFOS as part of your release on your site.
Thanks, Andy. This one, I think, Jenna, is probably going to get teed up for you. If there is no known association with any PFAS to known human diseases, what are the action levels based on?
Sure. I mean, the toxicology is actually quite complicated, and I could spend hours in the weeds and in the nuance here. But just to try to be careful to be accurate in my answers. So for PFOA and PFOS, for example, what we're seeing on the list I showed, an increase in cholesterol. So that would just be serum measurements where they've seen an association with a higher you see PFOA or PFOS. Sometimes some studies in some populations, but not consistently in all of them, there has also been an increase in cholesterol, but there has not been an increase in any kind of heart disease or stroke or type 2 diabetes or anything that diseases that are often associated with high cholesterol. And the increases in cholesterol are often statistically significant in the study, but within normal variability and not clinically relevant to a human disease. Same thing with the immune antibody response that the current draft RFDs are based on. They are based on a statistical association with a decrease in the antibody level to a very specific vaccine in children. But those children don't have an increase in actual disease for that disease or others. Perhaps we haven't studied them enough. And human variability on vaccine response and antibody levels is quite large. So while it's statistically significant, there's a lot of questions of whether it's clinically relevant. Does it matter? So that's the type of nuance that we're struggling with as toxicologists.
Okay, thank you, Janet. This next one goes to remediation. So I'm going to guess this would be to you, Andy. PFAS is prevalent nearly everywhere, which we've been talking about now for over an hour. After promulgating cleanup standards, how do you envision remediating these compounds? Will it be practical?
I was asked this question by my boss the other day. What happens if you find PFAS on the site, and how are you going to remediate it? And I went through a couple different scenarios. Yeah, we could pump and treat it, and then we have our PFOS that's stuck on the carbon, and we're going to have to eventually do something with that carbon to get rid of it. We could inject a carbon compound into the soil and trap it in the carbon compound in the soil as an in situ. But in reality, I think that at this point, where we are with remediation strategies, and I'm sure that there are 1,000 remediation companies out there that would love to sell all of us the golden bullet to be able to take care of PFAS remediation. I think a lot of it is going to go back to just point of use treatment. Make sure your drinking water is clean, and that's the way it's what I see for the time being until we get some better remediation strategies. I'm sure Janet can chime in on this as far as remediation strategies go as well.
Thanks, Andy. I mean, you said it just right. I think I won't belabor the point. I think at the end of the day, there are technologies that can remove and transfer the PFAS from one media to another. Destructive technologies are in the works. There's a lot of promise coming up, but so far, if we can mitigate exposure and stop the actual risk, then maybe we need to take a more pragmatic approach to a cost-effective and effective strategy for dealing with the remaining remediation.
Thank you. Melanie, not to leave you out, there's one here for you. ERIS PFAS data search slideshow shows that PFOA and PFOS were used in the search process. What about the other PFAS compounds? Are they also included somehow?
Thanks, Marianne. That's a great question. In fact, I was just typing the answer here. Yeah, so in our searches, when we were doing the online searching, we did not limit ourselves to PFOS or PFOA or any of the specific compounds. And in fact, we even we keep like an internal table of acronyms as well, like CA, Gen X. And then when we made our requests to the agencies, we did our best to make clear that we were looking for per polyfluorinated alkyl substances, not one specific PFOS or subgroup. And then I'll also clarify that when we are cross-referencing against the EPA master list, we're considering all of those. We're not filtering that.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that we're just about out of time, so we're gonna have to try to address the rest of the questions we didn't get to offline. So we will be sure to do that. So to read more about PFAS and its evolving story, please visit ERIS's info hub on erisinfo.com. I think we will be getting another little link in the chat function here, but that link will on the website contains a lot of curated articles specific to PFAS. And also to stay current on the other due diligence topics, you can bookmark the info hub and subscribe to our podcast there. So also please note that this webinar, we recorded it today and it should be posted on the ERIS website by tomorrow. So on behalf of ERIS and our audience community, I'd really like to thank our speakers for their knowledge and experience that they shared with us today. And to you, our audience, thank you so much for your attention today during the last hour and a quarter. I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on another ERIS webinar soon. Thank you.